So hello and welcome everyone. Good morning from Luxembourg, good evening to everyone joining from Australia. And welcome everyone to the fourth session of our lecture series in 2025. I am Kirsti Hagemann, I'm working for Spatial Foresight, and together with the office Sayan Baumann, we are representing the CIPU office. So what again is the CIPU actually? Some of you might still remember or might know. We are the national exchange platform for urban policy and urban development in Luxembourg. And we're very happy that you're joining us today in the morning for the already fourth session of this year's lecture series. So this year is all about the topic of the 15-minute city, but not only that, also in general, urban proximity and proximity in urban daily life. So just to give a short wrap-up of the last weeks, so who has already attended in the weeks before might have already gotten some insight into the status of the Luxembourgish situation on urban proximity from the LISER, so the Luxembourg Institute of Socio-Economic Research, which might play a role today again. And then 2 weeks ago, we got some insights from a German research project, and we looked into how that was applied also on the regional level. So we got some insights into how can we actually measure proximity and the accessibility of daily needs. And what we saw from there is that not only the quantitative research is relevant, but also looking into qualitative insights. So to understand why why we have certain mobility patterns and lifestyles. So for example, why do we use or don't we use certain infrastructure which is already there, just as a complementary aspect to the quantitative research. And last week, we opened the door and peeked into the connection of built environment and health. And I think these aspects, which we already heard in the last weeks, are very interesting for the session today, because as you will see, we might take up some of the elements which you might have already heard. We might deepen some of the topics, but also we will change perspectives and see some alternative approaches to what we have already heard. But don't worry, if you haven't been attending the weeks before, it will not be an issue for today, as we will have very interesting and insightful presentations, first from James Mant, who will take us across the world today and present an alternative concept from Melbourne. So we will look into the 20-minute neighborhood and the concept of walkability. And then afterwards, we will hear a presentation from Camille Perchoux from the LISER again. And she will take us back to Luxembourg to present some insights of different research projects. And there we will look into how density in urban built environment, green spaces, and mobility impact our well-being. So just some notes for the structure of today. This whole session, like always, will be recorded and will be made available on YouTube. So in case you want to rewatch something or are interested to see something again, or maybe you want to share the presentations of today with your colleagues, we will share the link via social media and the newsletter again. And it will be available probably beginning of next week. Then for the structure of today, we will first listen to both presentations, and afterwards we will have some time for your questions or discussion. So in case you have any questions during the presentations and you're very afraid of forgetting these questions, please feel free to just collect them in the chat, and we will then either read them out loud afterwards, or you can just raise your hand and you can ask them yourselves. So now I will stop my part of talking for now, and we will tune into Melbourne and give the word to James Mant.
Cool. Thank you so much. It's 8 p.m. here in Melbourne, so I'm at the end of my day and you're at the start of your day, everyone. But lovely to be here and to chat to you about this important subject, which I've been working on for several years. So just to give you a bit of background about myself, I'm originally from England. I moved over to Australia and settled in Melbourne in 2007. And
you're muted, James. Sorry.
Did it just mute itself in the middle of that?
Yeah, now we can hear you again.
Okay, sorry everyone. I was just saying I originally come from England and I moved over here to Melbourne in 2007 and have been working. I worked most of my time here in Melbourne since then in the state government in Victoria, which is and this is Melbourne behind me, by the way. I'm kind of in a helicopter or something. I then finished up with state government last year and started my own consultancy called StreetCo, which is focusing on walkable urbanism, really. So 20-minute neighbourhoods, similar to the sort of 15-minute city concept. So I'm going to take you through, I think, kind of, I guess, a bit of a practical example of how we've applied the 20-minute neighbourhoods here in Melbourne. I will just, there we go. Oh, so that's the photo that's behind me. So that's Albert Park Lake in the middle. Can you see my cursor on the screen? Yeah. This building here is actually the one that I'm in right now. I live in this building here. So this is actually where they hold the Grand Prix in Melbourne, and this is the CBD. And I guess kind of how it's characterized here is we've got quite a dense city, and then we've got a lot of low density and urban sprawl as well in Melbourne. So there's a sort of tale of two cities, I suppose, when it comes to livability in Melbourne. The inner part of Melbourne is very livable and connected and is a 20-minute neighbourhood and walkable. And then as you get further and further out, it becomes more car-based and more car-dependent. So what I'll do today is I just wanted to talk about Plan Melbourne. So Plan Melbourne is the metropolitan strategy for Melbourne. So similar to, the city plans that you have all around the world for different cities. And that underpins planning for the city. So I want to talk a bit about that because that's how 20-minute neighbours is incorporated into planning here in Melbourne. Then I want to talk about what does it actually mean? What do we mean by 20-minute neighbours? And we did a lot of thinking about this. So I'll talk about that. Why do we need them? What are the benefits? Then I'm going to talk about the practical implementation of it through a pilot program that we ran here. Then how things changed through COVID and how we responded to that. I'll talk a little bit about some of the research as well that we did in state government. And then I will just finish off by showing you some visuals of what I think it means to people. How places will actually change and what's the effect of implementation of this. So the policy context is Plan Melbourne was originally developed in 2014. So going from left to right. That was then, so the original Plan Melbourne did talk about 20-minute neighbourhoods, but it was quite not very well explained and no one really understood what it meant and kind of just sort of decided what it meant to themselves. Whereas in the 2017 version of Plan Melbourne that I was involved in writing, we were much clearer about what the policy actually is. So really clarifying it, defining it, so that it actually is implementable. We also produce an implementation plan as part of the Plan Melbourne, which had a specific action for government to address it and implement it. And so that's the pilot program that I'll talk about a bit later. So back in 2015, all those years ago, 10 years ago, when we were first looking at this, we really went back to basics and looked at the concept, and that map there at the top is a heat map, and that's from Portland in Oregon in the US. And I think they were one of the pioneers around walkable 20-minute neighbourhoods. I think they were probably one of the first city plans to adopt it. And so we went back and looked at their work, and we saw that it was really, it really was about walkability and accessibility. And so we came up with a definition, and that was the ability to meet your everyday non-work needs locally, primarily within a 20-minute walk, which means 10 minutes there and 10 minutes back to your home. So it's actually, in effect, a 10-minute neighbourhood, really, because it's 10 minutes from where you want to go. So yeah, and we put that out to consultation and had quite a detailed discussion across government about it. Thing that's important just to state is we did think it was important to embed the UN SDGs into the development of Plan Melbourne and the development specifically of 20-minute neighbourhoods. So we always really talked about how this is a real great example of a global to local kind of project which was implementing the SDGs. I think that was important to look up as well as have the local element. And you mentioned at the start this link to health, and we found that actually health is a really important aspect of what we're talking about. And in 2019, in the Lancet, which is you may have heard of, is a very reputable health journal. They talked about the importance of 20-minute neighbourhoods and densification. So, you know, how those systems can have a direct impact on climate change and obesity, and that we actually need intervention at that local level to create mixed-use environments with lots of destinations that encourage people to walk and cycle, and that has a real important impact on people's health, mental and physical. So I'm going to play a little video here. This is an explainer video that we produced when I was in state government to really explain the concept in a kind of nice and simple way. I'll play that now. It's not long.
How do we create a livable city? We start locally by making walkable neighbourhoods with diverse housing and access to local public transport. We design attractive streets and open spaces and provide services and destinations to support local living. We support local businesses and create places where communities can thrive. To build a livable city, we need sustainable neighbourhoods where people can access most of their daily needs within a 20-minute return walk from home. To find out more, visit the Plan Melbourne website.
So yeah, so that was I guess a promotional video that we used during when we released Plan Melbourne. Just to explain what we meant in a kind of nice and easy, simple way. Oh, sorry. But what I think is really important is we did spend a lot of time trying to ensure that we explain what we mean really, really clearly, because when we consulted on 20-minute neighbourhoods with councils and other people, they really had quite a varying degree of understanding about what it meant, and also wasn't really aligning with what was the intent. So we developed an explanation or a definition of what it is, and that is 20-minute neighbourhood is about living locally, giving people the ability to access most of their daily needs within a 20-minute return walk from home, with access to safe cycling and local transport options. And that definition is in Plan Melbourne, so it's policy for the state. And what that means is all planning schemes, so plans that councils develop in Melbourne, have to adhere to that policy. Then we also developed what we called hallmarks. So, I mean, what we mean by that is what really makes up a 20-minute neighbourhood. What are the key things that you really should have in that neighbourhood? And we developed these in partnership with councils. It was actually kind of a bit unusual that we normally, when the state government is developing policy, they do it kind of on their own, but we decided to bring councils in and other parts of government to help us develop it. And so those hallmarks there in the middle of the screen, they really outline the sort of, I guess, the recipe of the things that you should have in a 20-minute neighbourhood. So it has to be safe, accessible, connected for pedestrians, and cyclists and optimize transport. It has to offer high quality public space, open space, provide services and destinations for people to be able to use locally, facilitate access to public transport that connects people to those jobs and higher order services, and also deliver density at a level that means that you've got enough population to make those services viable, which is really important when you were talking about sprawl and that kind of thing. And also, importantly, to facilitate and support local business and local economy. Then we developed a picture or a sort of features. So what are the types of features you might see in a 20-minute neighbourhood? So things like community gardens, local schools, local shopping centres, safe cycling, that affordable housing, that kind of thing. And really, again, it was just another tool to help councils and others implement the concept. I think this is a nice, way to show just simply visually why we need to do what we need to do. And this picture here, that's split in Croatia, and I was on holiday there, so I took that photo. But it's extremely walkable. It's a beautiful walkable place. This is actually early development in Melbourne, so that a lot of the early settlement in Melbourne was actually quite high density. And this here is the sprawl that we're seeing in some of the outer areas in Melbourne. So, the challenges that we have: low density, impact on health, poor accessibility, isolation, limited participation, congestion, and then investment as well is a problem. So lots of challenges to address. And what do we mean by, and these are all pictures from Australia. What do we mean by 20-minute neighbourhood? So, we're talking about third places, cafes or places you can work locally, dense, compact streets with mix of uses, local parks, safe and connected infrastructure, affordable, diverse housing, high quality public realm, attention to detail, attention to design, a place experience, so place making. It's not just about the physical buildings, it's about the place and how you, design that place to create local identity. And then, of course, public transport. That one's actually from Canada. I don't know why, but anyway. So why is it important? This map is a map that was produced by RMIT University here in Melbourne by an offshoot of RMIT called the Australian Urban Observatory, which I do recommend you having a look at if you're interested. It's free to look at. And what they did is they looked at a range of measures across Melbourne, and they looked at all of those elements that I was talking about. I actually worked with the university to help them develop the criteria for this as well. And the green areas, the dark green areas, are those areas that are livable and walkable. They have access to lots of local services that are easy to walk to, lots of connection to public transport, good open space, access to employment, all of those things. And then as you start getting further out, those pink areas are the dark pink are the areas that are the worst, the least. So it's probably not surprising to see that kind of picture, but it really confirms that, there's a tale of two cities, as I said earlier. There's parts of it that are really not as accessible as others, less livable. Just quickly, we did a lot of work to try and bring together all the benefits. There's a lot of research out there around benefits of a 20-minute neighbourhood or walkable urbanism. And we wanted to just bring it all together to really create that compelling argument as to why we need to do it. And I was actually amazed how much stuff we found when we brought this together, which was really presenting such a strong argument for why we should do it. So, you know, there's improved well-being, there's, you know, a reduction in crime with surveillance, there's increase in retail activity and trading. Obviously, there's a reduction in pollution, CO2 emissions. The transport network is, you know, less impacted. Transport costs for your household go down significantly. So there's a lot of research out there which really gives such a strong evidence base for what we're doing. So after we developed the policy and we implemented it into Plan Melbourne, and as I said, councils then had to implement it in their local area, we decided that what we would do is actually partner with councils to work with them and work as a working partnership with them to implement the concept. So we worked with three different councils in Melbourne, in sort of those outer areas, which were kind of the more pink areas on that map I just showed. And we also partnered with the Heart Foundation, and I don't know whether you would have heard of that organisation, but it's basically a health charity for focused mostly on cardiovascular health, and that link to health that we talked about earlier was really important. So we wanted to have them on board as partners with us. And we also partnered with a charity called Victoria Walks, which promotes walking. And so what we wanted to do was test the delivery, trial best practice approaches, look at how we could improve policy and delivery and community engagement, and also try and collaborate across government, from state government, local government, but also across government departments. And we looked at these three areas in Melbourne, very sort of car-based, low scale, low density, not particularly attractive neighbourhoods. And we addressed each one in a little bit of a different way. So in the first council, it was really more about testing how we communicate the issues and the policy with the community. The second one was really about working with the traders, the business owners and the economic development part of council. And the third one was about really getting to the implementation side, because they'd already done a lot of work on 20-minute neighbourhoods. So there's a big range of approaches. And we did all sorts of work, which I don't have time to go into in too much detail today, but we did lots of consultation events. We did walking assessments, we did transport assessments, we did housing assessments, and we really tried to raise awareness with the community and the council around the importance of this concept. And to cut a long story, 2.5-3 year story short, we when I was in the government, we released a report called the Creating a More Livable Melbourne report. And in that report, we made recommendations to really back to government as to what we should be doing to implement. I won't go through them all now, but I can come back to it if people are interested later. I guess the kind of themes are having policy embedded into all plans. That was a really important thing. The design and livability, like the detailed design of places, is really, really important and important to the community. And also the collaboration and connections across government and agencies. There's so many silos in so many organisations, so many separate parts to it. We found that it was a really important thing to do to connect those different areas. And we found that the 20-minute neighbourhood as a concept really brought people together as they mostly understood what it meant. So post the pilot project, we Really, one of the things that I really wanted to do was I wanted to respond to the community. I think it's really important that when you're consulting, you don't just walk away and do nothing. There has to be a response, and you have to do something to implement it. So what we did is we assessed public works that we could make in the neighbourhoods, and we then went across government and we sought funding to implement those. And oops, yeah, I'll come back to that in a minute. But and what actually happened was we did secure some funding, just a small amount of funding. It was, I think, around $300,000. So in your, I don't know what that would translate to, but it's sort of similar level of what you would be used to in terms of the costs. But and that money was really used for very simple things like placemaking projects, tree planting, bike parking, cleaning businesses, painting, and just showing a bit of love and attention to those places. And it was extremely popular because a lot of these places hadn't had anyone go to them from council for a very long time, so they felt like they were being listened to, and things were actually happening, which was really good. And we were listening to what they were saying through the consultation. One of the things that has come up, and I'm coming towards the end now, is what we found was when we were talking to councils and the community about 20-minute neighbourhoods, we'd often give examples from Europe or other parts of the world, and people couldn't resonate with it here because they're sort of like, well, it's different. It's, we don't do that in the same way. So we thought it was very important to show what we meant in a local context. Sorry. And so what we did is we developed a series of kind of typical Melbourne streets and showed how they could change if they applied the 20-minute neighbourhood concept. So I'm going to show you those now, and then I'll finish up. So this is a really typical kind of street you might see in Melbourne. I'll just let it run through again. Low scale, very much like the street that we saw just a minute ago. And really this is about showing, okay, well, what, you're going to have a bit of density, it's going to be walkable, you're going to have connections. It's a really powerful way to show the community the change. Again, this is another look. There's a lot of this kind of strip shopping in Australia. So long roads with quite low scale, low density shops like this, with a few heritage buildings in there. So this is about how can we change those types of streets. Now this one is very typical in Australia. It's kind of like this car park surrounded by shops, and it's just really unattractive, and you see it a lot. But there's a real opportunity to show how this can change and be reimagined as a 20-minute neighbourhood. And this is again another typical looking at the back of what the photo I showed you before. Often this is very similar to one of our pilot neighbourhoods actually, and this is about rewilding, active transport, looking onto the waterway and that kind of thing. So these we found really, really useful when we were talking to people about 20-minute neighbourhoods. So that's my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I will just say I do a podcast as well. I didn't mention this to you guys, but City People, the people that build cities. So yeah, if anyone wanted to have a listen to that, it's on Spotify. And there's my LinkedIn and email if people wanted to connect as well. So thank you. I'll stop here.
Thanks to you, James. I think it was very interesting to see that not only the big hard infrastructure measures can make a change. For now, just to a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions to James directly, please keep them in mind or collect them in the chat so we can get back to those later and don't forget about them. For now, we will get back to the aspect which you mentioned, that there's a lot of evidence out there to why this is actually necessary and why it's wishful to have such a city. And we will, for that, go back to Luxembourg and look into the relationship between the built environment and well-being. So I will give the word to you, Camille.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my presentation. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor actually to present in your Colloquium series. So my name is Camille Perchou. I'm a researcher at LISER. I have a background in geography and public health epidemiology. And as you will see today, I would basically use both disciplines to exemplify how urban density and green spaces may influence well-being, why it is important also to account for individuals' daily mobility in those relationships. So I will not argue on why it is important to plan for health, but actually most of our population is living in cities. And so urban planning is a key lever to improve physical and mental well-being. Here in this presentation, we mostly focus on the neighborhood scale because it's actually a privileged scale both to observe, but also as exemplified by the presentation of James, to intervene on the dynamic between place and house. And actually in Luxembourg, our environment has been changing and changing. We expect it to change a lot and also to change a lot in the next decades. We're all facing a high demographic increase and very dynamic demographic changes. So those demographic changes are also comes with full debates on whether we should densify our neighborhood or whether we should also consider urban sprawling, which is the counterpart of densification. Those changing in these environments come with fundamental changing in mobility plans, urban transportation infrastructures, but they also come with some strong discussion on how to preserve restorative qualities in our cities, like green spaces, how to maintain an urban tradition, which will be implemented not only in urban planning, but on every aspect of our daily life. And of course, this leads to more consideration of how the environment is affecting our health. And here in Luxembourg, now we have a full department in the hospital dedicated to environmental health disease. Those changing in environment are influencing our health. And here I will try to exemplify how they may impact our physical health and our mental health with two different projects. Regarding our physical health, I will specifically focus on cardiometabolic disease because those are one of the main sources for global deaths worldwide. This accounts for 73% of global deaths. And more specifically, I will talk to you about the metabolic syndrome, which is a cluster of risk factors for metabolic disease. And it gathers high blood pressure, high triglyceride, high waist circumference, low HDL cholesterol, meaning low good cholesterol, and high fasting plasma glucose, which is like a predeterminant for diabetes. The metabolic syndrome is very prevalent in Western population, between 20 to 30%, and here in Luxembourg is no exception. We have more than 25% of the population having the metabolic syndrome. So in the method project I've been conducting with the Luxembourg Institute of Health and the Luxembourg Institute of Socioeconomic Research, we've been analyzing over 10 years how the environment in Luxembourg has been changing and how those changes in the environment have been impacting changes in cardiometabolic disease. To do that, we are using the Overscale Lux cohort study. And interestingly, we know that between 2007 and 2017, Luxembourg have been facing an increase of 24% of its population, meaning we were expecting to observe high changes in the environment. And we want to correlate those how changes in the environment with different outcomes. First of all, to see and understand whether this impacted the metabolic syndrome, but also some secondary outcome, and here today with diet, for instance. So, looking at the relationship between green spaces and health, whether it's green spaces in general or green spaces in the city, like urban park, we know and we have a lot of evidence that green spaces are protected for cannabis. But we do not know, or where we have little evidence, the type of green spaces may influence cardiometabolic health. Is a woody environment equivalent to a non-woody environment? Is the density of greenness impacting our cardiometabolic health? So we've been looking at how the association between changes in the green environment over 9 years in Luxembourg has been influencing changing in the metabolic syndrome. We've been computing the metabolic syndrome with a score. Here is the metabolic syndrome score. In a nutshell, the higher the score, the higher the risk of developing the metabolic syndrome. Here you have the references value, but I will not go into details. If you're interested, please look at those references. We've been also quantifying and qualifying green spaces in Luxembourg over 10 years. To do that, we've been interested in 2 measures. The soil adjusted vegetation index, which basically represents greenness density, and has been calculated in a grid of 30 meters by 30 meters based on satellite images. And a measure of tree cover density, how woody is your environment in a grid of 20 meter by 20 meter. And we've been measuring this around participants' residential neighborhoods, so creating buffer around their place of residence, buffer of 500, 800, 1,000 meters, representing first the residential neighborhood and then the exposure to those 2 measured green spaces in their residential. We have a population over 42 years old, 55% of women. What we did observe is that an increase in a 10% increase in greenness density was associated with an increase in good cholesterol, so it was protective for cardiometabolic disease. However, we did not observe any association with any other component of the metabolic syndrome, and we did not observe any association between tree cover density and cardiometabolic outcomes. Then we asked ourselves to what extent 10 years ago in my neighborhood, if my neighborhood was already highly green or not, this had an impact on how greenness impacts my cardiometabolic health. And we did observe that for the people who were living 10 years ago in an environment with low or intermediate greenness density, an increase in greenness was particularly protective for their cardiometabolic health, which is excellent. Finally, we did observe some differences in the association by the neighborhood socioeconomic status. In a nutshell, what we know is that an increase in greenness density play a preventive role in developing the metabolic syndrome, but that we did not observe any association between tree cover density and the metabolic syndrome, and those associations are not showing any differences between men and women. On the other side, urban densification has been hypothesized as a factor that may be protective for cardiometabolic health, as exemplified by the presentation by James. It means greater access to opportunities that may support healthy living lifestyles, to more active transport, to more urban infrastructure, to more healthy food environments. So we've been looking at this relationship between how urban densification is influencing the development of the metabolic syndrome over 10 years in Luxembourg, with this underlying hypothesis that we were expecting to observe a protective effect of densification. Again, we computed the same score, not going to go into more details, but again, the higher the score, the higher the risk of developing the metabolic syndrome. And we've been quantifying densification across 5 main dimensions: the design of the city, accounting for street connectivity. The higher the connectivity between the streets, the higher the possibility to walk. The density of population, but also the density of amenities. I have indeed higher opportunities to reach destination in close proximity to my place of residence. In terms of public transport, straight network distance to different public transport stations, or density of public transport stations. And finally, the mixity of the land use, meaning that the more mixed it's your land use, the more you have the ability to conduct your daily activity in close proximity to your place of residence. And then based on those 5 dimensions, we created an index representing urban densification. That was again calculated around the path and thread. What we did observe was that here an increase in urban density was associated with a higher risk of developing the metabolic syndrome, a higher triglyceride level, and lower good cholesterol levels. We did observe that those associations were particularly higher among people who 10 years ago were already living in a very dense neighborhood. This was also verified by looking at if those associations were different depending on the urbanity degree currently. And we did not observe any difference between men and women. In a nutshell, it means that our hypothesis here that we were expecting to observe a protective effect of urban densification on cardiometabolic diseases in Luxembourg was not confirmed. That actually urban densification may have been associated with a worsened metabolic syndrome score, but that we should take this relationship with caution, because actually they were mostly prevalent for people who were already living in very dense city at the time. With an increase in densification come changes in our amenities, and more specifically in our food landscape. So we've been looking also how densification has been changing in the food landscape in terms of accessibility and availability of food outlets. And so we've been looking at how long-term association between neighborhood, retail, food environment, and diet quality among residents in Luxembourg. To do so, we've computed a diet quality index based on the food frequency questionnaire. It's a validated index representing your diet quality. The higher the index, the higher the diet, the higher the quality of the diet. And we classified the food environment over 10 years in Luxembourg based on Luxembourg businesses categories. We've been verifying their location and their presence using Google Street Map, Google Street View, and the yellow pages. And we've been creating 2 main categories: healthy food outlets and less healthy food outlets. We've been computing different metrics, looking at simple metrics like the density of healthy food outlets and the density of less healthy food outlets. A bit more complex measures like the spatial accessibility to those healthy and less healthy food outlets. And more complex relative measures like the proportion of healthy and less healthy food outlets in your residential neighborhood again. What we did observe is we've been noticing an increase in every category of food outlet in Luxembourg over 10 years, but what was striking was that we observed a high increase in the density of fast food outlets. For urban participants, we've been observing that a cumulative exposure to a high spatial access to less healthy food outlets and a high proportion of less healthy food outlets in their neighborhood over 10 years was associated with a decreased diet quality index. However, we were a bit surprised to not observe the same relationship in the rural environment, where here an increase in the access and the density of healthy food environment was also associated with a decrease in diet quality. So in a nutshell, we have been observing a drastic increase in fast food outlets in Luxembourg over 10 years. That's long-term cumulative exposure to unhealthy fast outlets in general is associated with a poorer diet. But with that, we observe different dynamics between urban residents for whom those relationships are stronger and rural residents, where here we did observe unexpected associations that may be explained by other underlying factors. That's it for your physical health, but we can also look at this picture between densification, protective effect of green spaces, in terms of mental health and mental well-being. Here we've been developing a study named FragMent, looking at how urban environment are influencing momentary, daily, and chronic stress. And why stress? Actually, because everybody's experiencing stress, it's a risk factor of 75 to 90% of disease. And there are multiple theories underlying the fact that your daily life environment is actually shaping your stress levels. We've been developing different methodologies to assess this relationship, but here today I will only focus a specific survey that is trying to assess stress levels and participant exposure in their daily life. More specifically, it's a two-step survey where our participant can inform us on their chronic stress and not only indicate their place of residence, but also all the activity location they visit on a regular basis for us to be able to qualify and quantify the environmental exposure they experience over their daily activities and not only the one from their residential neighborhood, which may just partially represent their environmental exposures. And then they are invited to engage in a 15-day mobile survey combining a GPS, some 1-minute questionnaire multiple times per day, and some vocal samples in order to assess stress vocal biomarkers. I'll go into more depth. So in this study, we use what is called geographically explicit ecological assessment, a repeated sampling of participants' perceptions, behaviors over the course of the day, but it's in situ and in real time, which is a very strong asset to actually grasp what is happening in participants' daily life. So 4 times per day, we're asking our participants in 1-minute questionnaire how stressed they are, what activity they do, how they perceive their environment, with whom they are, and to do a vocal task. We combine this information with GPS, so it gives us information on where, when and where they are, what they do, with whom, and eventually if their perceived environment is actually an issue at the moment. So here are some examples of core questions we might ask them. It's very simple, it takes a few seconds to answer, and it gives us very precise information on their momentary stress and potential determinants. We do also measure very precisely participants' movement, mobility patterns, and transport mode based on their GPS information. Here, it's only my data and not the data of the participants, but you can see that the participant is aware of the GPS data we are collecting, and we show not the map, but a timeline of the different transport modes that she has been using. And finally, we use different task to invite the participants to actually record their voice in a fun and also informative way for us. So we do combine very structured vocal tasks like reading a text, describing an image, counting down, but also at the end of the day, we ask them how they were, how was their day, and if they want to develop a bit more on their stressful events. At the moment, we started the data collection in November. We have a bit more than 800 participants registered. It's a countrywide GMA study, which is quite rare, but it's also the first GMA study combining this study design and biomarkers. So if you're interested in the study, we have a website. If you're also interested in participating, we are actively looking for participants. Please do not hesitate to have a look at the website. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Camille, for your insights into the methodology of how we can get evidence on the relation between the built environment and well-being. And then I would like to give the floor now to the audience to use the chance to benefit from our speakers' experience and expertise. And I see that we already have 2 questions actually in the chat. From Christine Lein, would you like to ask your questions yourself? Then you can just unmute yourself and ask them directly. Otherwise, we can also read them out. So I think they're directed at James Mant, so I would just read them out loud. So how easy is it for people who are used to doing everything by car and coming to the front door by car to embrace these new concepts, especially if, as I understand it, their workplace is outside of a 20-minute radius and they are therefore likely to be traveling by car?
Thank you. That's a really great question. There's quite a lot in there. First thing is there's an issue around behaviour change, and I think if you're living in an area that's low dense, kind of those sprawling pictures that I talked about and showed earlier, really you don't have a choice. So you know, it's not going to work unless those places change and are retrofitted. So I think if you're in an inner part of the city and you're driving everywhere, then you're probably going to find that it's not as easy as public transport or active transport. So therefore that switch and that behaviour change is much easier. But people who are reliant on their car for doing everything, especially, as you say, if their workplace is not within the 20 minutes, then it's very hard to expect people to make that change, and you can't expect people to make that change. What I would say is, I think, you know, we've seen a change in how people work through COVID now. You know, obviously a lot of people are working locally or working at home, and that has changed the dynamic about how you use your local area. And I think one of the things that we found in Melbourne, because we had very long lockdowns, is that it really showed you what you had access to or what you didn't have access to, because in some areas you didn't have great access locally. So, but when you did have great access locally, people loved it and appreciated it and understood the importance of it. So, yeah, so that it's a very difficult and it's a long-term change. There was another part to the question, I think, around sort of retrofitting and structures, you know, to do with supermarkets, and I think so. The issue actually, it's good that someone mentioned supermarkets, because supermarket design can have a really important impact on how people use a place. And what we have seen in Melbourne, and I'm sure around the world, is that supermarkets are getting bigger and bigger, and people are driving to them. So there's less of those local small scale shops and more of the big drive to shops. So again, it's another part of the design of new places which we need to address in how they're designed, and that you have, you know, greater density and smaller, more compact shops that people can walk to rather than drive to.
Okay, thank you. So no,
sorry,
go
there's
ahead.
Another question. Do you want me to answer this? There's another question there about crime. So yeah, so there has been evidence that having a 20-minute neighbourhood or a denser, more vibrant neighbourhood that's cared for does actually reduce crime for 2 reasons. One being that there's more eyes on the street, there's more passive surveillance of the street, and people feel safer because of that. And the other is around pride of place. So when a local community feels pride towards their local centre, that actually has an effect on crime as well. So yeah, there has been evidence to suggest that it can lead to less crime rate.
Okay, might I just come back to your first to your answer of the first question, because I'm also very interested in that. So did you come across any resistance maybe from the public when it came to your concept? Because I think, as you said, there's something much bigger behind that, also societal and behavioral change. And I think this is what research is also still trying to figure out. Why do people use certain infrastructure and why don't they use certain infrastructure when it's maybe already there?
Great question. Yeah, definitely. We had a lot of pushback, and it's mainly around change. So, you know, I guess the crux of it is people don't generally like seeing change, particularly when it comes to new development and density. So they see that as a negative on impact on them. And I think what we tried to do is talk more about the positive benefits of growth and how it can improve places and make places better. Now, I'm not suggesting that everyone believed in that, but I do think that it is a really, really important part of addressing this, because if you can't get community support and community buy-in to these concepts, then you're not going to get, it's not going to be easy to implement them. So, you know, there's a real negativity in the built environment space in Melbourne, and I've seen it in other countries as well. I'm sure it's similar where you are. So it's trying to get positive sort of interaction on these concepts and understand why we're doing it and why it's important and what the benefits of it can be. But yes, it is a hard it is hard to make that argument. Absolutely.
Okay. So picking up the people and having them participate from the beginning on, like always, I think in planning is definitely benefit, but can imagine that especially in this context that it's very difficult. Are there any more questions from the audience right now? Otherwise, I would maybe okay, we have someone raising the hand. Jean-Claude.
So my question was, so with the on how to change the societal behavior for people. So with the examples that you showed, so with the little changes that you had in the streets and in the different parts of the city, so maybe this could help people getting used to changes. So because it's very small, and then maybe later on you can just go on to bigger changes, as just changing the street or the way on, or closing streets even though. And I was wondering if you have any experience on this, so that if you start with a little change that people get used to, that you can just bigger it up step by step, and just then come to your final point that you say then, okay, the issue was, or the objective was to close the street, but as we can do it immediately, so to get the people on the way, so we do it by different steps, step by step, and by the time they get so used to it that they simply appreciate it.
Thank you. The great question again. I totally agree. Those small scale changes are so important in terms of making the longer term larger change. We have had a few projects in Melbourne that have taken that approach, where it's been a temporary sort of, I guess, pilot or you know, experiment to see whether a change will work or not, and then that's become permanent. And we've had road closures and, you know, things like that. And so that is important in itself, to make those changes, but also just improving places through these types of interventions help with the argument of, okay, but we actually need to change more significantly in the long term. It's a really powerful way of getting the community on board for greater change in the future.
Thank you. Then I see we have one more question in the chat. Also to you, James, about smaller cities in Australia, if they're facing the same problems or if they're rather close to the 20 minutes neighborhood concept.
Yes. Interestingly, Australia is quite different to Europe in the way it's sort of settled. we've got a lot of large cities, so Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, Brisbane, Perth, but then we don't have very many smaller cities like we do in Europe. What you have is you have vast areas of Australia, because it's absolutely vast, with quite small settlements in between. There are some medium, but it's not in the same sense as in Europe. And so what you find is those regional or rural settlements are quite disconnected. They might not have public transport, they might not have a train, and they're a long distance from the big urban areas. So funnily enough, I found that a lot of these regional areas and these regional smaller towns really like the idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods, but the actual amount of change that's required for them is huge because everyone drives everywhere. So it's a different concept, I think, in those places, because it's more about, you're still going to have people driving to the urban area because people are dispersed over a big distance. So you're still going to have that happening. But how do you make sure that people, once they get to the urban area, don't drive within it? So it's a bit of a different kind of approach. But I do think that in my experience, I found that the concept resonates as much, if not more, in those smaller places.
And then we have another question which also relates to the transferability between the Australian cases and European, or especially now in this case German. So in Germany, residents have to contribute to the remodeling of a road financially. What's the situation there in Australia, and who is bearing the costs of redesigning neighborhoods? Yeah,
well, that's interesting. I hadn't heard of that in terms of residents contributing, but that's not how it works here. It's either the state government or the local council, so or both together, and we've also got a federal government as well. So without going into too much detail, it could be partly funded by them as well, but it's all public funding. It's not funded by residents or traders. I know in some countries as well they have trader organizations, so business groups that get together and they pay higher taxes or rates locally together as a group, and then they use that money to improve either the business, the shop, or whatever it is, or the street or the area. And that's an approach that they have, I think, in Canada and the US a lot. But I've not heard of the residents contributing. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I think it depends on how much your part of land is part of the street, and then if there are two sides of the street, and so it is according to how much part of the land you have. Yeah.
Right.
And it's always a big topic in the participatory processes then in the planning.
But I suppose, from the one of the things that I think is really important is actually making sure that people, whether it be residents or business owners, they have an actual foot or skin in the game, as we call it. Like they're contributing in some way, so they're part of it, and they therefore have to, they care more if they're contributing. So I think I really like the idea of like, for example, what I was just talking about with the business owners having that local tax where they can work together, because it's really important the public and the private realm is thought about together.
All right.
Yes, I have another question to Camille, because it would be interesting to talk about what can be concluded for urban planning. So what would you say, what specific priorities should cities set to reduce the cardiometabolic diseases through planning? Is it a focus on mobility, nutrition, green spaces, or combination?
Thank you very much. I think it's a very good question in the sense that that there's those diseases are multidimensional, and there's rarely just one aspect of our environment that you can tackle and get an answer for the whole health problem. But what we do see in a very consistent manner is that, of course, preserving green spaces in urban environment will always be protecting either your cardiometabolic health, but also your mental health. So densification and green spaces are not necessarily opposed. I think there are many ways now and many literature highlighting how to still integrate green spaces within cities. And this should, I believe, definitely be a key axis for future planning and ongoing planning, whether it's planting a tree, preserving parks, having green roofs. I think it's key. Now, of course, densification and the result we observed on densification in Luxembourg were a bit surprising, but we were also expecting to observe more changes in Luxembourg over this 10-year period than the one we observed, and we were still surprised to see that most of the time changes in the environment are slow and modest over time. And I believe this is also a strength of the projects that James Mant proposed today, that some small changes may be noticed by the resident population very quickly and embodied somehow, just in their behaviors, but also in the longer term in their health. So densification is definitely a key topic for Luxembourg in the coming years. So I believe the question is less about should we promote densification or promote urban sprawling. Urban sprawling means, as we said, less active mobility, less health promoting behaviors, eventually more crime, as James highlighted. But it's more about how do we densify our neighborhoods in a way that will still be promoting healthy lifestyles.
Okay, and James, I see you nodding just in general as a question. Having heard each other's presentations, do you think, or have you come across anything that is opposing each other? I mean, especially when it comes to the densification, have you heard anything which was like, oh no, we approached this in a completely different way? Or do you think the evidence from your side, Camille, aligns with how you approached it in Melbourne?
Thanks. Yeah, I thought it was Camille's presentation was really interesting, and yeah, I think it was surprising some of the results from the densification, but I also found it, kind of interesting as well in the fact that you've got like you were talking about the foodscape and the diet and how that potentially can be, when you've got a lot of access to fast food and that kind of thing, then it obviously impacts your health. So it certainly made me think differently about it, and it does make you think, well, what are the actions that we need to take as planners to address that, and I really like the focus on green space as well. And something that I think is really important is making sure that green space is of high quality and that it's usable, and it's not just a patch of grass, which it can be in some cases. So yeah, I thought it was really interesting, and yeah, thanks, Colin. Really fascinating.
Okay. Are there any further questions or remarks, either from the audience or from you two? If no, then I would like to thank you all for first of you, the two of you, for your presentations and the answering of the questions, then to the audience for the questions and listening in. And yes, thanks for making this rather unexpected connection between Luxembourg and a place which is definitely further away than 15 minutes from here. I think it just showed that there are so many more dimensions to this whole concept and to this instrument, which can be used for spatial planning. which shows that it's on the one hand very complex, but also it opens a lot of doors to make spatial planning maybe a bit more diverse and to think about it in a more holistic way. Just some remarks. If you're curious about the FragMent project, we also have an English language CIPU blog, and it will feature an article about the research project in the next week. And then when it comes to the following session of the colloque, which will already be the last one, by the way, it will take place next Thursday in the afternoon again. And there we will dive into another concept yet again, which will be about the 5-minute city in Swiss city, actually, which has already been implemented. And so we're looking forward to welcoming you there. And that session will be held in German again. So for now, I would like to wish you all a sunny afternoon or noon and wish you a good night, James. And I hope you enjoyed the session and looking forward to welcoming you next week. Thank you all.